Okay, everyone, welcome back. This time we are here to talk about a topic I've wanted to talk about a long time. And to talk about that topic, I have Dr. Rebecca Rowe from Texas A&M Commerce with us. And she specifically is going to talk about one, her fandom, but we're going to get into children's literature and how Disney uses their stories to reach kids and the lessons they teach kids and um, the kid in the traditional sense, but then also we can think about that kid in all of us, that type of thing as well, because a lot of the stories that Disney has told and adapted from other sources um, hits both of those demographics, right? So first, I want to welcome Dr. Rowe to class and go ahead and begin with your kind of introduction to Disney, an origin story, if you will, how you became the Disney fan leading up to what you do today with Disney.
All right. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here today. So I don't have memories before Disney. I honestly can't remember a time that I wasn't a Disney fan. One of my very earliest memories that I can like put a date to was actually in the parks. And my dad, when I was a kid, his company would have their annual conference at Disney World. So he would take me and my mom with him, and my mom and I would go play in the parks while he was working. It was great. But I have a memory of there's this brick wall like right outside the USA part of Epcot. And I remember walking along the wall and then sitting on it, and I burned my thighs. And that is like
Mm.
legitimately one of the earliest memories I have. So I don't have a coming to Disney story because it's always been there. My parents tell me they weren't into Disney before I came along, but everything from my very earliest memories are us as a family really loving it. So my parents are still really into Disney. We go and see all the new Disney releases together if we can. It's still very much a family tradition. Um, and yeah, I guess I kind of just grew up with Disney. Um, my particular year in school was considered the weird year because we were always into Disney, even when all of, the other grades were too cool for Disney. Like my grade, all of us for some reason still loved Disney all the way through K through 12. So I've always been surrounded by it. And then yeah, I found out at some point that you can study Disney and that could be a thing that you do with your life. And I got really excited. And yeah, that's that's me, I guess, with my Disney fandom.
Okay, thank you. Quick question, when you were going to Disney
Mhm.
as a kid, did we talked before where we both grew up in Texas. Did you fly or did you drive?
Mixed. So there were a few. My first plane ride was, oh, I'm sorry. The first ride I remember was to Disney. The first one I was like 6 months old. I don't remember that one, but the first plane ride I remember was to Disney. But we did drive a couple of times and we would stop somewhere in the middle and stay the night and then finish the drive. It's about 21 hours from my parents' house. Um, yeah, it was always a trick. And I think it's interesting because when you live in Texas, you're in the middle of the country. The parks are on either coast. And it's
Hmm.
always interesting to me to see like some people ended up doing Disney World, some people did Disneyland. My family is very much just a Disney World family. And
Hmm.
that's all we ever went to because we're on the east side of the state, so it's slightly closer. But I had friends growing up where their families only went to Disneyland. And I
Okay.
think interesting things about being in the middle.
I was in East Texas, and so it was probably 16, 17 hours to Orlando.
Mhm.
And so we always drove. And I
Mhm.
remember we would back before, like, car seats were really a big issue. We would My grandmother would lay down the back seat in the Suburban. They would make a pallet and we would sleep. My sister and I would sleep. And then one time we went with our cousins. So there were like 5 or 6 of us back there and everybody was sleeping. and we would leave in the middle of the night. So like we might leave at like 2 or 3 in the morning.
Mhm.
And so I have a lot of memories of waking up and like we're on I-10 kind
Mhm.
of getting toward the end of the Florida Panhandle and thinking like, oh, look, there's a sign for Walt Disney World. Like we're here. And it's like, it's another 4 hours or like 5 hours that we have to go. But like those are some of my memories is like waking up, already being in Florida, being
Mhm.
really, really excited to be already in Florida, and then kind of the reality of realizing like, oh, we're this like we still have a long way to go. The Florida Panhandle's a pretty, that's a pretty long stretch as well.
You still keep going. It's like driving through Texas. You just
Yeah,
keep going forever.
yes. And actually this last summer was the first time I went to Disneyland. I had
Mm,
only been to Walt Disney World before that. And we were going to go in May 2020, and that didn't work out. Um, so this last year when we went on a family vacation to San Diego, we drove up to Anaheim and went to Disneyland and California Adventure. And it's really, really neat. Like it is so easy to do with family. Like you walk up in the parks or like literally it's like 500 feet between them. It's very, very nice.
yeah,
But
I'm going to my first non-Disney World park this coming summer. Me and a couple of the other Disneyteers are going to Disneyland Paris. I'm very
oh,
excited
cool.
to see a
Yeah.
non-Disney World park.
I I had a trip planned one time to that didn't happen because of the pandemic that I was going to go to a conference in London. And
Mm,
so we were actually going to fly in. I forget where we were going to land. Oh, my wife's a big her family grew up in Nebraska, and the Cornhuskers football team was playing in Dublin, Ireland. So we actually like could have flown, landed in Dublin, seen the game, and kind of driven down to made our way down to um, the conference in London. And I was like, hey, if I'm this close, like might as well take a quick plane trip
mhm.
to Paris and try to do Disneyland Paris. And then obviously like the Eiffel Tower and all the stuff that other people do. But um so anyway, back on the highway, sorry. Um Now as an adult, you let's talk about what you do at Texas A&M Commerce. So talk about kind of your professional background, how you got into working with and researching literature, and then how you chose children's literature, and then leading into what you do today at the university.
All right. Whew. Trying to figure out the best place to start. So I decided I wanted to teach English when I was in eighth grade. Um, in seventh grade, I had some less than stellar English teachers. And then in eighth grade, I had one of my absolute favorite English teachers I've ever had. Love her dearly. And I just realized it's like that's something I could do. I could be that kind of safe haven and encouragement for other people that she was for me. So I decided that, and I was like, I'm going to teach high school English. That's what I'm going to do. And then I got into high school, and I'm like, not staying here longer than I have to. So I decided I was going to teach college English, and I knew that's what I was going to do. And then I got into college, and the university that I went to for my undergrad was Hollins University. And Hollins University, unbeknownst to me when I went, is one of the major children's literature programs in the country. Um, and I found out that children's literature was a thing you could study. And I remember finding that out and being really excited because of Disney, right? I like Disney was always in the back of my mind. I didn't know at that time that you could do Disney, and obviously now I do. I was just like, children's literature, that'll get me closer to Disney, and that sounds
Mhm.
delightful. So I started doing that, and I ended up focusing on fairy tale retellings for a while, for a few years. Because again, Disney, it's like it's related to Disney. I'm getting closer. Um, and I do still really love fairy tale retellings and studying fairy tales and etc. But from there, I started looking at adaptations more broadly, specifically adaptations of children's literature, and the way that identities shift in the process of adaptation. So that started with a paper I wrote on Maleficent, looking at the way that the idea of gender and villainy were shifted from the 1957, 59, whatever, Sleeping Beauty into the 2014 Maleficent. Um, and then I wrote my master's project on Into the Woods and looking at the stage production versus the film production, or the film version, which is Disney, and thinking about how the concept of age and childhood was shifted there. So I kind of found my home with that project, and that's what I have spent all of the years since then working on, looking at adaptations and how things like gender, age, race, and ability are shifted in the adaptation process. So for the last few years, my research has focused primarily on the concept of adulthood within children's media and why children's media is so invested in adulthood, considering it's supposed to be for children. And
Mhm.
a lot of that work has been around Disney, because obviously Disney adults are alive and well and very present. So they make it easy to do my research. So that's what I've been working on. Now that I'm at Commerce, I'm working on a book about adapting American adulthood is the name of it. Um, Robin Muir and I co-founded the International Journal of Disney Studies, so we're working on that. Robin founded the Disney Culture and Society Research Network, and I'm head of operations of that, so I'm doing that. So I'm doing lots of Disney things, which is really, really delightful. Today, I've actually been reading conference abstracts for our conference this summer, and it's been really delightful to just dive deep into Disney and just be able to focus on that. Like I've always loved, I never do research on something that I don't love, because research is time consuming and it can be boring at times and it can take a really long time. And if I don't love something, I'm not going to be able to get through that project. So I've always focused on things that I've loved. But now that I'm out of literature, like I don't have professors telling me what I can
Mhm.
do and that I need to stay within literature. Now that I can do whatever I want, everything in my life is becoming about Disney. And it really is just fantastic.
Yeah, that's what's so cool about just fandom in general
Mhm.
is that, and about being like getting to research and being a professor, is you do research what is interesting to you.
Mhm.
I started researching group behavior based on the fact that I've told this story before. I watched a football game in 2008 between the Texas Longhorns and Oklahoma Sooners, and Texas beat Oklahoma, but got passed over at the end of the year to play in the conference championship game and the national championship game because they lost the late season game. And I remember watching the championship game that Oklahoma was playing in and thinking, look, I don't really want Oklahoma to win because I think Texas should have been there.
Mhm.
And then kind of that realization, like, why do I feel this way? Like, that seems like a really kind of mean, negative thing to think.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's what got me started researching rivalry, and it got into group behavior and just kind of general group behavior outside of sports. So, like, and then um, beyond that, getting to uh, once I studied a few things in the sport world, let's expand this, and we started comparing outside of the sport world. And the first comparison was actually with Disney parks, and then other things. So, you do get this. You get to follow your. It's really really fun to be able to follow your passion,
Mhm.
and it does. One thing we talk about in the class is if you are a fan of something and it does not hurt you. So in other words, you're not a member of a cult where you can't get out of something of your own choice. If it doesn't hurt you, if it doesn't fundamentally hurt someone else, if you're doing things that fundamentally hurt other people or kind of are for like detriment to the broader society, that's not a good thing. Like you shouldn't be doing that. But if it doesn't fit into those two categories, it doesn't hurt you, doesn't hurt other people, then you should embrace that because it makes you more happy. And so I really, really enjoy seeing people that are able to do what they want to do, and are able to, in this case, study what they want to study. I mean, being like I have said for a long time, I'm part of 1 or 2% of the world who absolutely love what they do,
Mhm.
being a professor. But also, since I kind of started like let myself do a deeper dive into my Disney fandom, it's just your enjoyment just has grown
Mhm.
so much. And so it's so nice to see that other people having that ability to be able to do that.
Well, and it's
One, oh, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, it's really interesting to hear you say that, like, you can be a fan of anything as long as it's not hurting you or and it's not hurting someone else, right? Totally agree with that. But what I was thinking about, as I've been doing research on Disney adults, there are a lot of people who feel very strongly that Disney adults are like hurting society in general, which is really fascinating to me. So this idea that a love of Disney is somehow ruining what adulthood should be,
Hmm.
or that this kind of joy is irksome to other people, and so we should stop being joyful, things like that. And I find it really, really fascinating, right? Because I hear it all the time. It's like if something doesn't hurt you, doesn't hurt someone else, it's fine. But where that line is drawn gets a little bit blurry when we're talking about something that is often very, very public, or at least has been made public through social media. Um, so I Disney adults get such a bad rap. But, I think the conversation around them and whether they are actually harming other people is really fascinating. I
Well,
just want
and you know, at its core, it's really, I mean, I've heard many people say this, like you are a fan of something, you know, you choose something to be a fan of.
Mhm,
And, you know, there are people who are fans of sport teams and spend I mean, the Super Bowl was last week. There were
yeah,
a lot of people there who spent a lot of money to
mhm,
be at the Super Bowl.
mhm,
And to have that experience for, you know, that 4 or 5 hours or whatever. And they probably wouldn't take that back. They wouldn't change that experience, you know? And so it is interesting when you talk about and I kind of feel like, you know, Disney adults over the last few years have gotten like that term has gotten more attention than
mhm,
maybe some other fandoms.
mhm,
But, you know, it's all and I study in groups and out groups. So it's basically if somebody's not in your group, like then, you know, people will feel like they're a threat to
mhm,
whatever your in group is. And so it has been they've definitely gotten more exposure, more attention over the
mhm,
last few years. But it's, you know, when you look at what you are a fan of, then, you know, people are fans of various things.
mhm,
And there really are things that people can be fans of that hurt them or hurt other people. And
mhm,
those are the things that people should be aware of. If you're a fan of, you know, something that doesn't like you're not physically fundamentally hurting someone, like you should be allowed to do that. So yeah, thanks for saying that. One thing that I was thinking when you talked about how you got into your research,
mhm,
and it is specific with Disney adults. When you mentioned Disney adults, what other like entertainment function or part of entertainment do you think could compare to Disney adults? I just talked about sport fandom,
mhm,
and that does have like some pretty deep roots depending on where people grew up, and
mhm,
there are people who are lifelong fans of their sport teams. But you know, what other entertainment companies or entertainment kind of items are there? I mean, there's, you know, we have Disney adults, We
Mhm.
do have people that are lifelong Harry Potter fans.
Mhm.
Um, we have things like Swifties and people who follow different musicians or people
Well,
like Swifties, but what others?
I was that when you asked, the first thing that came to mind was K-pop fans because
Okay.
that is a very passionate group of human beings.
Hmm.
Um, just like Disney. And it's people that you'll see, like it affects their wardrobe, the way that you'll see like Disney bounding and people wearing Disney merch and stuff like that. So, but the more that I think about it, there's something specific about Disney that relates perhaps more to Harry Potter, um, in that people start so young with it, right? And
Yeah.
often it is passed down from one generation to the next. The best comparisons I've seen are sports, as you said, right? Because like I'm a Cowboys fan because I grew up in East Texas
Hmm.
and everyone around me was a Cowboys fan and it wasn't much of a choice, but that's fine. I'm here. Um, and Disney is kind of like that. It's often passed down through generations. Harry Potter can be kind of like that, but the other thing it reminds me of is kind of this phenomenon of the 90s kid, right? People who are growing up, realistically, it's like late 80s, 90s, and
Yeah.
early aughts is really what 90s kids describe. But it's a very specific moment and a moment in the kind of entertainment landscape um, where suddenly children's media was a lot more important than it had been before.
Hmm.
Obviously, this is where we get like the Disney Renaissance, but it's not just Disney that's having that moment of reoccurrence. This is when Harry Potter starts getting really popular. Nickelodeon, for those of us who growing up in the US who did not have cable, like PBS Kids was
Hmm.
my jam for years, right? Like all of these things are coalescing in the 90s to create this moment that people still look back and people call themselves 90s kids, and really what they're referencing is the particular entertainment industry that they grew up within. um, and I do think generations work in similar ways, right? Like other generations. This is, specifically a subset of millennials, but I think generations can work in really similar ways to what we see with the Disney fandom, in that there are a lot of generational things are, historical, social, and entertainment touchstones, right? And so the millennials is interesting just in that the big touchstones for millennials continues to be things from childhood.
Hmm.
Is very much like the Disney adults, and many 90s kids do identify also as Disney adults and vice versa. So,
And I also think, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you are the literal expert on this, not me. Um, when you talk about 90s kids and generational like kind of shifts and everything, the 90s, late 80s, 90s, early aughts, that is the time period that just is kind of making its moment now also, with like remakes of like there's remakes of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
mhm,
There last year was Super Mario Brothers. I'm
mhm.
not really sure. Barbie doesn't really fit into that because Barbie has been around for so long.
Barbie is a
But I think, but I and I'm not sure like when Barbie kind of cartoon animation started, like when it made its big move. But like it seems to be about 25, 30
Mhm.
years is kind of when things start to sort of make their comeback, or like have a moment, if you will, 20 years maybe. And so that kind of seems like what is happening now
Mhm.
with the 90s kids and the content that the 90s kids enjoyed, which makes sense because now the 90s kids are the ones producing this content and making the decisions that are being made. That's the
Yeah.
reason all this works. But is that like am I missing something else there?
No, there's some really interesting, so a couple things. One, 100% it's that 90s kids are now making things. And 90s kids are the market that that studios are aiming for because they're the ones with the most money right now, right? Like it's
Hmm.
the middle adulthood, is where 90s kids are. In case you're wondering, friends, millennials are all grown up now. Um, and they are the ones with kind of the most purchasing power. So a lot of media is being aimed at them. There's also some really interesting research about how 20 years is the cycle
Okay.
for nostalgia things to come back. And it has been for a while. And that's generally because that's how long it takes for people to have children. Because what you end up seeing is that, you know, this generation has kids and this generation is interested in this generation's stuff and this generation wants to pass
Hmm.
on their stuff to their children, right? So you get this weird thing where the media cycles are about that connection between the generations as generations move. Um, so 90s kids right now, we are in our moment, wanting to start passing down all of those things that we love from the 90s, and those things were mostly children's media. So you're having a moment where a lot of children's media is coming back from the 90s.
Okay. Um, and so the next thing that I want to get into
Mhm,
is we how Disney uses their well, oh, first, one thing you mentioned, you said about Maleficent and your research. Look, what Cinderella was an adapted story.
mhm,
Was Maleficent an original character from Disney, or
mhm.
was she adapted from someone?
Um, so are you saying that the Maleficent in the original Sleeping Beauty movie, was she original to that, or was she?
Yeah, was she original or was she adapted like the rest of the story?
A little bit of both. So the two Sleeping Beauty stories that Disney drew on for their original film were Perrault's The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood and Grimm's Little Briar Rose. And both of those stories have an elderly fairy character who curses the princess.
Okay.
Um, but she's not necessarily malevolent. Um, it's usually just because she got left out. They invited all the other fairies and they didn't invite her, and she's very testy about it. And so she curses the princess, which is maybe an overreaction, but also is not like mistress of all evil level
Yeah.
of, um, and she's not even the fairy isn't a villain in either version of the story. She like curses the princess and pieces out, and she's not there for the rest of the story.
Yeah.
So they really did amp up this good versus evil thing that they love to do in Disney to create this amazing villain that we've had for so long.
Yeah. Well, and then, that brings up a good point where you said they amped up like the good versus evil.
Mhm,
More recently, and I promise we are getting back to the question. More recently, it seems like Disney has, with Wish, they had a traditional villain.
mhm, mhm,
Although, for me, like I was like, oh, I wish they would tell the more of the backstory of this character. And then at the end, they were trying to go back to like because it was like the 100-year celebration movie. So they were trying to go back to like, here's where he is. But I would love to have heard more about kind of why he felt the way that he did. Almost
mhm,
like in Encanto, where you when you're watching Encanto, we talked about this yesterday or 2 days ago in class. When you're watching Encanto, at one point you think the uncle could be the villain. And then
mhm,
at one point it's like, oh no, he's not. It's the grandmother. She's the one who's like the villain. And then during Dos Oregatos is when you kind of learn like, no, like this is why she has been doing what she's been doing, because she feels this need to protect, and she feels this like it is her responsibility. um I almost kind of felt like they had some moments where the villain and Wish talked about that, but they didn't
mhm.
really go full into it. And I kind of have I think maybe they didn't want to because they had done that so much recently. But what I was going to say is, recently it seems like Disney, with the exception of Wish, has not really had a villain per se.
Mhm.
It's been more dealing with trauma and dealing with like generational trauma and things like that. Or decision making and being responsible for decision making. Um, am I missing something there that like was it seems like there has been a shift and maybe there's going to be a shift back to that traditional villain from the beginning.
I'm trying to think through. I think the last villain that I can think of is Tamatoa, and he's not usually like
Hmm.
billed as a villain. So the last like villain that like gets sold as a villain is maybe Hans or Dr. Facilier, one of the two.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is interesting. So I'll be honest, I was kind of glad that Wish had just like a straight up
Yeah.
villain character. And I do appreciate they try to give him somewhat of a background. And I'm always sad when they try to make Chris Pine into a villain. But um, so good and evil are very complicated. And for a long time, Disney's like, no, it's black and white, like
Yeah.
good versus evil, everything's super simple. That is a problematic thing to teach children, right? Because it
Hmm.
teaches them to see in black and white, and the world is so much more complex than that. So I'm glad they changed, right? And we're starting to get more complicated representations. I've seen people talking about how, as you say, intergenerational trauma, that's like the real villain. A lot of the recent Disney films, like even thinking of Raya and the Last Dragon, everyone ends up coming together really by the end of
Hmm.
it, and there's not really a villain, right? Um, because Namari ends up being okay. Anyway, but so it's good that Disney is seeing goodness in shades of gray rather than just black and white. At the same time, I think it's really harmful to not teach children that there are some people that are just evil. Like
Hmm.
people who like Hitler. There is no there are no two sides to Hitler. Hitler was
Yeah.
bad, right? He needs to be a villain. Um, and I think it's important for kids to get both sides. So I'm hoping moving forward, we're going to get a mixture
Yeah.
of films that are like, hey, goodness and evil are like complicated, and also films that are like, also, there are people who are just going to be bad, and like you need to be able to deal with them too.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, uh I like to share with the class and anyone who will listen. Um, the first issue, the cover of the first issue of Captain America was actually Captain America punching Hitler. He That character was created to like kind of show this dichotomy of like here's what it means to be a patriotic American, and like here's who they're battling against, and even things like Iron Man representing the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Fantastic Four, which Marvel announced Wednesday, the new cast for Fantastic Four. That was represented, and I think it's such a cool choice that they're going to the 1960s when the comic started, because really what the Fantastic Four was representing the space race and the United States space race with the USSR. And so, there's all these really interesting things that these these creative companies used to teach these things or give symbolism that people didn't really realize. One interesting thing when you said, there are there are different shades and whoever's good and whoever's bad, um, good versus evil kind of comes from your perception.
Mhm.
Um, the latest uh, the the Disney Plus series Percy Jackson, which was a very good adaptation from the books and did extremely well for the streaming service. So there is a season two, thankfully. Um, but that's kind of a thread throughout
Mhm.
is somebody who his mother even says, just because someone looks like they're a hero doesn't mean they're a hero, and someone who looks like they're a villain is a villain. And so for me, it led to some really, really cool conversations with my boys, because my oldest last year in school learned Greek mythology.
Mhm.
And so he knows, I think, probably more than I do about things like that. But we had this really cool conversation about Medusa one time,
Mhm.
because like in the show and in the book, they kind of tell more of her story and why she ended up the way that she did. And it wasn't really because she necessarily did anything bad. It was because the gods, she angered the gods, and the gods in Greek mythology were like they punished her because they were envious of her. And so it's really cool. Like those types of those stories are really, really cool. One example I always think of is Star Wars. That when you're young, you think the rebels are always the good people,
Mhm.
the empire is always bad. And then
Mhm.
as you get older, you wrote like that's kind of when it's like, well, a character like Han Solo, was he really good? Or was he like, and then there's this creation of like the term anti-hero for people like him, that
Mhm.
it's like he wasn't really good. He just ended up like he kind of ended up on the, if you want to talk about it this way, in Star Wars lore, he ended up on the right side of history. But
Mhm.
like, where could he have been? And so it is really, really interesting when you
Well,
bring up things like that. Go
I
ahead.
think Star Wars is a really interesting case because we have all of this new everything that's come out in the 21st century besides the movies, which I ignore at this point. But we've had, the Clone Wars, the series, which complicated a lot of things about
Hmm.
the prequels and what we thought we knew was going on, and is absolutely gorgeous. But then we've had, Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, Ahsoka, all of that stuff, which are, again, every time it sets up like a character and it's like you think you know what side they're on, but they're
Hmm.
not. But something that's become really clear through all of this is that a lot of characters, I think Han Solo and the Mandalorian are both great examples of this, but you have characters who maybe do good things, but they're doing it to protect the people they care
Yeah.
about. And the fact that what they're doing is good is just kind of like secondary to them. And I think it's really important to show that on both sides, right? People do bad things because of
Hmm.
people they care about, but people do good things, not necessarily for the greater good, but because of the people they care about. And I think
Yeah.
it is important to show how, as you say, like you don't know which line they're going to fall on because, or which side of history they're going to fall on, because that's not actually their goal. Like all
Yeah.
the Mandalorian wants to do is take care of Grogu. If he just like happens to save the Mandalorian people at the same time, cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is very different from, Luke going off and trying to be, save the galaxy and things. So
And like as an adult, Luke was all I always almost felt like I should like Luke. He should be the example when I was a kid. He should be the example of like who you want to be like
mhm,
in a situation. But you get older and it's like, no, maybe it was Han Solo, or maybe it was someone else.
mhm,
Or another great character I love talking about is from, especially in the Marvel universe, the cinematic universe, the presentation of Loki, and how he does things for at times very, very selfish reasons, which I
mhm.
think happens a lot. Just people look at things and we look at them from our own perspectives, and so we obviously, like, sometimes without even meaning to, we're looking at things at how it will benefit us or how it will hurt us. And then like he at times has done things for the people he cares about. And then like kind of his, I don't want to give too much away if people haven't watched season 2 of Loki, but sort of where that season ends and like where he is at that point, is it's very, very interesting. And I think he's another great character that kind of teaches that, um, I guess, don't judge a book by its cover type of like reaction.
Well, and what's really interesting with the ending of the season two of Loki is that it ends in something that's in Norse mythology.
Hmm.
Um, what happens to Loki in the show happens in Norse mythology, right? So, like for people who are really familiar with Norse mythology, they know that's where his arc should go.
Hmm.
where he should end up. And so for those of us who are less familiar, because I definitely Googled it after I finished the series, um, like it was such a surprise for him to make that choice and to do this like deeply selfless and heroic thing there at the
Hmm.
end. But also reflecting back on his character, I'm like, yeah, no, it makes perfect sense that he would end up here. And the fact that they were able to write across movies, across TV shows, and get us to that point, I think is really, really impressive.
Yeah. Um, so the original question was, what, how does Disney use the stories they do to teach children, and what are they teaching children through these stories? Kind of give us a rundown of, like maybe where it started and where we are now. Like we mentioned, like, it is good for kids to see that not everything's good, not everything's bad, but it's also helpful to see that there are some people that are just like you need to stay away from, and you need to be aware of those people, be cautious of those people. So kind of take us through like maybe where they were early in the company, how they were teaching children, what they were, and where they are now.
Okay, so I guess my first comment is that you have to understand when Walt Disney started making, um, when it was the Disney Brothers, and even through most of Walt's life, his goal was not to make things for kids. His goal was to make, he has several great lines about this. He talks about it throughout his life. But he wanted to make um, media for the kid in all of us. That's an
Hmm.
expression he uses several times. Um, and so he wasn't necessarily, at least the way that he tells the story, right? And we have to always take it with a grain of salt. But the way that he tells the story, he was never out to like teach children anything, right? At the same time, we obviously know that Disney has become one of the most omnipresent part of children's lives. It's almost impossible as an American to escape Disney, no matter your age, but especially as a kid. So there are some things that you see pretty consistently across the movies that are kind of their lessons, right? So the good and
Hmm.
evil is definitely one. A lot of the rest of the messages that are, problematic, it can all be boiled down to um, Disney's conception of childhood. So Nicholas Salmon has this great book, Babes in Tomorrowland, which I talk about in every interview, I feel like. Anyway, but it's he's tracing the way that Disney aligned itself with the concept of the child between the 1930s and the 1960s. And his argument is that they base their idea of what a child is on Walt's own childhood.
Okay.
So we're talking middle class, white, Midwesterner, male, heteronormative. That is what the child is. And so that's what Disney is trying to teach the child to be. And so we see it in a bunch of different ways. We see it in the very traditional kind of gender norms that we get through a lot of Disney, right? Where the girls are damsels in distress and the guys are the heroes who have to come and save them. And for the longest time, you had these really interesting hero characters, and then girls are just singing about love. And it's a little frustrating at times. Everyone for the longest period of time was white. It's like people who get to be in fairy tales, who get to have these love stories, they're all white people. Obviously we all have to aim for the concept of love. It's like love conquers all, and that's where every movie has to end, is with true love's kiss. Um, so a lot of the older stuff was based very much and kind of that premise, right? Trying to teach the child how to be Walt as a child
Hmm.
effectively. Obviously, things have gotten better over time. And the Renaissance on Disney really has been trying to think of diversifying what its child is. And so teaching children different ways to kind of exist in the world. They're not always successful, right? There's a lot of critique to be made on Aladdin, Pocahontas, Mulan, movies like that, both the animated versions and the live action versions. Um, but they are getting better. Like you mentioned, several of their more recent movies. If we look at Encanto, at Raya and the Last Dragon, at Moana, they're getting better about showing, strong women, men who are strong and also can have feelings, that aren't just like courage and bravery. Um, we're getting different cultural perspectives, especially the Latinx perspective, which Disney is doing better and better. Um, so I think one of the things that Disney in the 21st century is teaching kids is that there are people who are different from you, and there are people who have different perspectives from you, and that's going to shape how they see the world and how they act. And this goes back to our good and evil conversation, but I do think it's a really important message, that Disney is able to develop, and they're able to develop it partially because they are such a giant company at this point. And so they can give all of these different stories that are telling all of these, or showing all these different perspectives, versus when they were coming out with one movie every few years, back in the olden days. Maybe they weren't as able to diversify. And I say they weren't able to. They could have diversified way more than they did. They chose not to. But it's a lot easier now with how big their company is.
Okay. Um, and while you were talking, I was making more notes for the rapid questions at the end. So uh, the what do you think? Well, one thing we talked about before we started recording was the cradle to grave.
Mhm.
So touch on that and tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, of course. So Disney is very good at, what media experts call, reaching people from cradle to grave, which is the idea that they make content for people at every age. And one of the things that Disney is doing, or one of the things that they're teaching in all of their media, is how to be a good, um, fan of Disney, or consumer of Disney, if we want to get more, businessy about it. But they start off kids really, really young. You can get board books about Disney. Obviously, you have the Disney Junior shows. I think we're going to talk about one of the shows Disney aims at, the youngest kids in a minute. But um, and then they age them up a little bit into, your um kind of tween content with the Disney Channel original movies, and with shows like Amphibia and the Owl House. And then you get into teenagers with things like Marvel and Star Wars, and then you age them up into adults with some of the newer Star Wars stuff that
Hmm.
is, kind of more adult, and things like Echo, from Marvel, which is rated MA, right? So like they're
Yeah.
moving further and further into the adult market. So the idea is that at every point in your life, there is something that Disney is aiming directly at you. But at the same time, Disney is also, um, it Disney wants people to bring the younger media with them, even as they age. So I grew up watching Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin and Mulan, and I love them. And now as an adult, I can buy t-shirts I just bought an Aladdin t-shirt like a week ago. You can buy engagement rings based on each of the princesses. Like there's all of this stuff that the original media may be aimed at children, but there are ways for adults to engage it in like adulty ways, right?
Hmm.
And of course, adults still watch these movies and they pass it down to their own kids and things like that. So Disney teaches, people from a very young age how to stay engaged with Disney, and then gives them a way to age up with it. So they never have to leave Disney, and they can always be in the Disney world.
Yeah, and I mean, I mean, some people argue that the company did actually do this because they are that subversive, but um I mean it kind of like someone becoming a adult fan of Disney and growing up with Disney. literally created a new term, Disney bounding, because
Mhm.
they wouldn't allow adults to dress like characters in the parks. I mean, things like that, those are examples of strong fandoms.
Mhm.
You know, the fan made content that people produce about the various arms of Disney, Marvel, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, like all of those things. I mean, they're as strong or stronger than a lot of other fandoms out there where they're creating fan made content. I mean, obviously, like I talk about this is fan made content. The fact that this class and podcast exists. Um, so it is like they are extremely good at making sure we talk about the escalator in marketing. They are very good at moving people up the escalator. They get them on at a young age, and then they can just, they can keep them engaged throughout their life cycle. And what's really interesting is, for me, I remember being in like kind of late junior high, early high school. I guess that was the age where it was kind of like you shouldn't talk about Disney as much. But that was also the age when like Toy Story was coming out. Um, and these like I remember seeing Toy Story and just thinking this has changed everything. I mean, it was almost like it was like when people explain and when people describe seeing Star Wars for the first time, that this changed things. Like Toy Story was that for like my age, along with like Jurassic Park because of the the animation they used in it and the special effects. And so, but so there was maybe a little bit of gap, and then they go and they try to fill that gap with the purchase of Marvel Studios, which is an extremely popular, and Bob Iger's written about it in his book. Other people have written about it from outside of the company about how important that acquisition was to kind of regain traction with that group. And it's also the reason why one of the reasons why Marvel is just referred to as Marvel. It's not referred to as Disney Marvel like Disney Pixar is.
Right.
Um, and so yeah, they are very, very good at doing that. What are some uh, what are some examples of like what are some examples you've seen either just in everyday life or when you're at the parks or anything of kind of people staying engaged
Mhm.
with Disney Anna and the Disney fandom?
So I talk about this in a little bit in a chapter I wrote on Disney bounding, specifically Disney bounding in the parks themselves, which of course is like what Disney bounding, as you said, that it was originally coined for that, but now people Disney bound wherever they feel like it. But Disney bounding in the parks I find really fascinating because when you're Disney bounding is not the same as cosplay. So cosplay, you're in full costume, you're in a space where like often you're performing as that character, right? And Disney bounding is not that. Disney bounding is effectively you are dressing as a child who is allowed to costume in the parks, right? So it's this idea that you want to be allowed to do the things that kids are allowed to do in the parks.
Hmm.
And so when I'm the last few trips that I've done, when I was watching everybody, Disney bounders engage with the space, like kids, right? Like they play around with it. So it's more of the Disney ethos that they're engaging with than anything else. But also just, oh my gosh, kids in the Disney parks are just so fun most of the time. Sometimes they're screaming and crying. A lot of times they're just fun to
About
watch.
4 or 5 o'clock, you gotta make sure they've
Yeah, everybody needs
had
a nap.
rest or have
Um,
eaten.
so I went, there's a family story where I went to Disney World before my brother did, and my brother is 8 years older than me. He had to stay for school, and I did not. So then the first time he finally went with us on the trip, because it was when he was not in school, apparently I took him around and introduced him to all the characters as if they were. I was like, hey, you remember me? This is my brother. And like, I just introduced him to everyone, right? Because for kids, these characters are a part of their lives. There's some interesting research happening around how kids relate to animation, and kids often see animated characters as real, right?
Hmm.
So then they go to a park where they're actually real, and they're like, yeah, for sure, this makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And that's why it can be so traumatizing when they see Winnie the Pooh take his head off. But so I love being in the parks for that reason. It's not just about the cast members, although I do love the cast members. It's watching all of the guests interact and just like be a kid for a while,
Hmm.
in ways that often adults don't allow themselves to do in other areas of their life. So that's really fun. Um, can you remind me what the question was? I just got so excited about the
Just
park.
just examples of like people like remaining in that Disney fandom throughout life.
Yeah. So, I mean, conventions are a great example of this, right? Where you
Hmm.
have all of these people who are cosplaying as characters, and they're cosplaying. I love seeing cosplays that mix different characters together. So like zombie stormtroopers is usually one of my
Yeah.
favorites. You get some really interesting ones where people are mixing across Disney studios. So you'll have a character who's some mixture of like a Marvel and a Disney princess. And that's just really fun to see. You see so much creativity in in these fans. You also have fan fiction and fan vids. I love watching Disney fan vids. They're fantastic. There's a YouTube production company called Patty Cake Productions that make
Hmm. Yeah.
Disney fan
Yeah.
vids. Um, but a lot of times, so with fan fiction, you never know how old the people are who are writing these things. Um, Even when they're very explicit and sexual, you're like, this could still be a 12-year-old. I have no idea. But with fan vids, you can see them. You're like, aha,
Yeah.
adult.
Yeah.
Um, so it's really fun watching those and seeing these adults at various ages, um, doing something with Disney and just having a good time with it. Um, Trying to think what else. I keep thinking of my dad. My dad is 60, he'll be 64 this year, and he loves Disney so much. Like he just he has Disney Plus. That's where he spends most of his time. He
Hmm.
just really loves all things Disney. And I do think that's one thing that I love seeing movies in movie theaters for many reasons, but one of the reasons I like to see who goes to see movies,
Hmm.
especially an opening weekend. And every time I go see a new Disney movie, there will be a lot of people there who are adults without their children or without
Yeah.
any children. So there's one way that adults continue to engage with Disney is simply by watching the stuff, right?
Yeah.
And being a fan, turning out on opening weekend, even when opening weekend is, Thanksgiving holiday, to see the newest Disney movie and having fun with that. So those are the first examples that come to mind, at least.
Okay. Uh, and I tried a Disney bound for class. I could not Disney bound in a park. It's way too hot. To me, that's like I see people post about Dapper Day, and I'm like, there's no way I could do that.
There's too
Like
much color.
whenever I go to the parks, I'm wearing like I am in shorts and like usually this hat and like a polo. That's one thing I wear polos all the time for some whatever reason. But like I can't when this last year when we went to California Adventure,
Mhm.
the day that we were at California Adventure, I wore my Captain America shirt. That was my kind of attempt to like Disney bound, I guess, in an actual park.
I went in December. I went for New Year's. So we were there December, January. And that is the only way I could ever imagine Disney bounding because it was, I mean, it wasn't cold because it's Florida, but like it was cool enough that I could get away with doing Disney bounding. And that was a lot of fun. But in the middle of the
Yeah.
summer, just too daggone hot.
Yeah. It's um so then what does I'll ask this question together so that
Okay.
we can get on to our last topic. What does Disney, excuse me, do well in teaching audiences, kids and adults? And also, what do they need to improve upon in teaching kids and adults from the stories that they're telling?
So they're very effective at what they teach because Disney, they're great storytellers. And as a human species, we're really good at learning through story. And because Disney is so omnipresent, like whatever they're teaching, people are gonna learn, right?
Hmm.
And so they're really good at it. But that can also be the downside in that sometimes what they're teaching is not necessarily the most helpful thing. And I talked about this earlier, right? About like all the representation problems that Disney has had and to some extent continues to have. But I think the one thing that they really need to work on as far as teaching is that Disney has this habit of taking something and making it the Disney version, right? And a ton of scholars have talked about this. This is, I'm not saying anything new, but anything Disney makes, that is now what people believe, right? So
Hmm.
people used to talk about this with fairy tales and how people don't really know the classic fairy tales, they know the Disney version. And people talk about it with children's literature. It's like nobody knows what actually happens in Pinocchio. We know the Disney Pinocchio,
Hmm.
right? Um, Things like that. But we see it also with the way that Disney represents cultures. And what I'm thinking of, mainly because it's close to home for me, is Princess and the Frog, which they attempted to try and do something well with representation in Princess and the Frog. But there's a lot of problems with the movie, especially with the representation of voodoo. However, Disney is all encompassing. And so people think the Disney version is the accurate version. So I think one of the things that Disney really needs to do is they need to stop trying to be an authority on cultures that are not their own, right? Like they tried to trademark Day of the Dead when they were making Coco, which is just
Oh,
ludicrous.
I didn't realize, I did not realize they tried to trademark the actual, like,
They tried to
yeah,
trademark Day of the Dead. They also tried to trademark Loki, which again, it's just like
yeah.
Friends. That is like a mythological person. But so they need to stop trying to be the authority. They need to, I don't even know how they would do this, but they need to make it clear that they are not the only voice in the room and that they shouldn't be the only voice in the room. The problem is, I don't know if they can actually do that
Hmm.
effectively because, like, I was looking in preparation for today, I went and looked at the content warnings they have on things on Disney Plus. So, like, when you go into Dumbo or whatever, it comes up and
Yeah.
it's like, hey, racism abounds. They're not specific, but they do take you, they have a website you can go check out where it talks about like why stories and representation matter, which is great. Like that is something that Disney should be doing. But how many people actually go and look at the
Yeah.
website, right? So I feel like no matter what Disney does, they have made their reputation too much on stealing other people's stories, on stealing other, cultures, that it's going to be really hard for them to walk back from that and give more people space, especially because that is not financially sound thing to
Yeah.
do. But I mean, that's realistically what they're going to have to do if they are serious about bringing more voices into the conversation.
So that brings up something I talked to someone about a couple years ago, and it was actually when Disney Plus was in its first year of operation and before the retrenchment in content on Disney Plus. Now that now that companies are looking at more profitability, not just subscriber growth. One thing I had asked then, I'll ask you, is on something like Hamilton, for instance, when they purchased the rights to Hamilton to the pro shoot, they put the pro shoot on Disney Plus,
Mhm.
and then they actually created two, I think it was two, there may have been more, like programs about Hamilton where they would bring in the stars of Hamilton and everything. It was during the early days of the pandemic, so everything was online. Um, they would bring in like historians and everybody into this conversation. And it gave me the idea that, hey, this is a really cool idea because there are a lot of things with Hamilton that people, with its popularity, people have come out and said like, hey, this, these are the issues that it doesn't really address, and it just kind of uh, stumbles over some of these things. And so, do you believe that as an entertainment companies have the responsibility to teach something from their works?
Mhm.
Or is it more, here's your exposure to this certain topic, to this area? Here's where you can go get more information. Which one, like, what do you think is the kind of the more appropriate approach?
I think part of my problem is that Disney has been acting like their version is the version. So
Mhm.
if we go back before they owned the National Geographic and we're looking at things like Disney Major,
Mhm.
they would send this to schools. Schools still use
Yeah.
things like what is it called, the Living Desert or whatever
Mhm.
their thing from the 1950s was. But schools still use that to teach, and it's inaccurate. They like it is false in its representation of things. Um, so and Disney, I mean, not so much with their more fictional stuff, but they will send some of their things like Coco into classrooms with, pamphlets on how to teach this to your students to teach them about Day of the Dead or whatever. And when they're doing that work, they're still saying, ah, we are the arbiters of knowledge and
Yeah.
understanding of this particular thing, right? So while I love seeing them do things like the Hamilton, behind the scenes shoots, it's still Disney doing
Yeah.
it, right? And if somebody else did it, would as many people have watched it? Maybe not. But until Disney is more accurate in their representations, I feel like it's a little two-faced for them to be like, oh, we're gonna do something that's wrong, but then we're gonna make a documentary about it to
Yeah.
tell you it's right. Like that feels like eating your cake or having your cake and eating it too. So I don't have a good way forward besides the fact that they should obviously be hiring more scholars all the time. They should pay me money to do this thing. Um, I don't have a way forward, but it's not my job to figure it out. It is the
Yeah.
job of the multi-billion dollar media conglomerate to figure out how to more responsibly deal with the way that they educate the public.
Well, and that kind of led to like a follow-up question is, if Disney did produce such content, how, how would it be received?
Mm.
Is it better that a third party present that type of content? Because then, like, there's always, it's the Disney touch, or not just Disney, it's any organization, any company, they do have to look out for certain things with their company,
Mhm.
right? So when they do something, and I actually didn't know, like, I didn't know about the Day of the Dead. I didn't know that they send some of these more fictional things into the schools. I do remember watching some of, the true life adventures and things like that. Um, but like I wonder if Disney did make an attempt to teach things that were truly educational without a Disney spin. I still think people might, I wonder if people would think, well, this is still Disney doing this. There is a little bit like they kind of have to protect their brand. So like, is this really something that's trustworthy? And then it gets into the point of, like you said, if a third party does it, are are enough people going to watch that?
Mhm.
Because um, it's kind of that, where's the responsibility? Is the responsibility of the entertainment company to entertain and also educate, that edutainment, or is it the responsibility of the entertainment company to say, hey, here's something, if you want to learn more about it, go learn more about it because it's really interesting. um, so the next thing that I want to talk about is, in my view, it seems like, and it's not a Disney produced content, it's acquired content, but there is there the cartoon, the show Bluey is so, I mean, it's a phenomenon now. There are Facebook groups about parents who love Bluey, adults who love Bluey. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And so first, for people who don't know what Bluey is, it's a family of blue healers. It's two sisters, Bluey being the oldest sister, Bingo is her younger sister, and then they have a mom and a dad. They live in Australia, and it's short 6 or 7 minute episodes that, it's like every episode has some type of imaginative play. They're always playing a game. And so it might be something like where they go to the grocery store and they're going with their dad. Um, and then they'll call out the name of the game they're going to play. And the dad will be like, "Oh no, we've got to play this game." And then all of a sudden he's walking around um, the grocery store acting like a bird, or like Bluey is the one pushing the cart and he's the child like trying to throw things into the cart. Like it's all of these things. But let's start with the popularity of Bluey. And I have my ideas, but I want to hear, like, what do you think some of the reasons that show has become just so immensely popular, and it is one of the shows on the Disney Plus platform that regularly shows up in the Nielsen ratings when they're released?
So I do think there are a lot of reasons. Um, I think honestly, one of the reasons is the fact that this is just a really lovely family. So much of media is about pitting kids against parents or siblings against each other or whatever. And this family just really loves each other. They don't always agree, but they always come to an agreement at some point, and there's always, like lots and lots of love in there. So I think that's part of it. It's just really a joy to watch, right? I think a lot of us would be like, have thought at some point or another, it's like, that family looks like it would be fun to live in, right? Kind of escapism there. But I think it also has something to do with the way that this particular show educates and the kinds of lessons that it's doing. So I give you a little bit of background. I cannot stand Dora the Explorer. I can't sit there with a full episode of it. It makes me irrationally angry. And it's not just Dora. It's any of the shows that are made like that. And these are shows that are aimed at young children, where the main character talks to the audience. And it's like, where's backpack? It's on your back.
Hmm.
It's in the name. Anyway, but um a lot of shows for young children are like that. And I understand why. It's part of the electronic babysitter, where they're trying to keep children's attention so parents can go and do other things. Um, so like I get it. I understand what's going on. But it is not necessarily a joy to watch as an adult.
Hmm.
Versus what Bluey is doing is something very different, which is they are um they're talking to the whole family as a unit. Like I do think this is supposed to be family viewing. So we have messages that are for the kids, like um oh, I'm trying to think of a good one. Oh, there's an episode about Bluey needs to learn to let Bingo voice her own opinions,
Yeah.
right? And listen to her when she says things, right? So that, aimed at kids learning to listen to others, etc. It's a message you would see on any young kids TV show. Um, but then you have episodes like there's one where they're playing in the park and Bluey's dad is, playing with them and doing all of these really funny things and being very silly. And then another dad walks into the park and he
Hmm.
stops and he doesn't want to keep doing what he's been doing. And the kids are like, play, play, play. And he's like, no. And so that episode is about him learning to not care what other people think
Yeah.
and just have fun with his kids, right? So the messages are for kids and adults alike. You get in almost every episode, you get kind of a dual lesson going on um, between the generations. And I think that makes it a lot easier for adults to watch. The fact that they are part of the audience, very clearly part of the audience. Um, and to the point where the adult characters will often look, at the camera, will look at, straight at the viewer and make eye contact. So there is this idea that this is for adults too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those are the two main reasons that I think that adults at least are really into it. I think kids just really love it. Like I have three nephews, 12, 6, and 4, and they love Bluey so
Yeah.
much, all three of them. And they can quote like the entire series. They watched it through so many times. Um, and they like to play the games that they do in the show. So we'll be watching the show and we'll have to stop it and play the game and stuff like that. So they're very engaged by it.
Like some of the episodes that, there's the one that comes to mind all the time and we reference all the time is Fairy Tales. Where the dad is telling the story about picking on his younger brother.
Mm.
And then like his younger brother like can't he says jinx and he won't talk. And so he can't talk and his brother won't say his name. And his mother comes and he won't say his name. But like there were so funny things in there, like they're and our kids quote it now where um that he'll be telling the story and they're like, wait, you were on a bike without a helmet? He's like, it was the 80s, man. This like things were different. And then there's one part where Bluey asks something and Bingo's like, it was the 80s, man. It was different. Like things like that are so funny. And like he makes a comment on when he's teaching kind of the moral of that episode where he's like, grandma, meaning his mom was his mother. He's like, grandma was right. Not about the perm, but she was right about this. And like because that was something that like people growing up in that area or that era like remember. And then, it ends with like it's called Fairy Tales because it ends with he says, "Oh, and they're like, "Well, I thought there was a princess in this." He goes, "Oh, there is." And he tells the story of like the the person who actually says his name is his now wife. Like when they were kids, they met at this like campground. And so the girls are like, "Ooh," and the wife's like, "I don't remember that at all." He goes, "But it could have happened." And so like, things like that are so funny that it is just it's one of the shows that has found its way into so many different generations. And like no matter what stage of life you're in, it is like it's like infiltrated everything. I mean, we talked about Disney being really, really good at grabbing people from cradle to grave. And like I said, this is a Disney acquired show. This is a show that's produced out of Australia, but I mean, it's fantastic. There's a part where the two sisters are always frequently pretend to be, they call them grannies, and they call each other Rita and now the other name escapes me, Janet. And like they'll say, "Nice parking, Rita. Thanks, Janet." And there are bumper stickers about that now. There are like, people in parking lots will actually call each other Rita and Janet. And because they've watched this show. And so it's just, it's almost like this is a show that has just entered the zeitgeist
Mhm.
and really almost really like non-cartoon or non-animated shows do. It's usually people quoting from like Modern Family or quoting from, it used to be Seinfeld or Friends or like things like that. Um, All in the Family and stuff like that, the before that. But like now it's this is that show, which is really, really interesting to me.
I think and I think it's partially that it's unironically heartfelt and joyful, and it just feels good. Like that sounds so silly, but so much of our TV today, even the media aimed at young people, has to have an edge to it, and
Hmm.
has to be smart in some way, or has to hold joy at arm's length. And this show is not that. It is just so joyful, and it's never afraid of just enjoying life. And that is just, it's so different from everything else that's on the market today. I think that's part of why it's so enjoyable. It makes me think of the original Addams Family, oddly enough. Um, when the creator of Addams Family was making it, he came up with the concept that they were going to be everything that families on TV then were not. So
Okay.
the couple is actually going to love each other. They're going to love their kids. The kids are going to get along. Everyone's going to be weird. But like the family dynamics, he was like, why are all the families on TV so mean to each other? Right. And that's one of the reasons that scholars say that people still love the Addams Family as much as we do,
Hmm.
right? That initial just, they want to be around the people they're around. They're not angsty or mad or whatever, right? And I think we're seeing that again with Bluey, and that's why it's had such a hold on the zeitgeist, as you say.
Yeah. The last thing on Bluey, and then so we don't run out of time. I also find it really interesting the length of these episodes. They're 6 or 7 minute episodes. And so it's nice, like it's just nice quick hitters, and especially for parents, if their kid says, "Sit down and watch this with me." There's a lot of resistance if something, if a parent knows something's 20, 25 minutes. But if it's 6 or 7 minutes and it's really 4 or 5 minutes without the credits, you're thinking like, oh, okay, well, we can do this. And then you find yourself 20 minutes later or 30 minutes later, you've watched 5 or 6 of these, and you're like, well, but you've been entertained the whole time. Um, it's just so interesting. Like that show is so interesting. The impact that that show has had. At this point, we'll get into our rapid questions, but I want to make sure. Um, there's already probably 1,000 things in my head that are rattling around that I'm wondering we need to do we need to do other interviews with other people also, because I have so many more questions. But is there anything that I've left out? Anything you think is interesting or important to mention before we get on to the rapid questions?
Hmm. The only other thing I would add is that Disney is in many ways very American, and I'm sure you talked about this with other folks and in your class. But childhood is culturally constructed, and the Disney child is very much an American child. So what you've been seeing over the last 100 years is Disney, to greater and greater degree, exporting American childhood, which has actually
Hmm.
started to shape and affect childhood in other parts of the world are starting to look
Hmm.
more like American childhood because of Disney, which is a really interesting thing. But now Disney is also trying to show global childhoods. And so you get things like Super Team, I believe is the name of the Pixar short, which I love dearly. So it'll be interesting to see moving forward if we start getting more globalized childhood in Disney, but also if that's going to affect both American childhood and also childhood everywhere else.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, that was just my last thought.
Well, and I mean that's a great point that, Disney did for a while. I don't think they do anymore, but they had the I can't remember what they're called now, but they were language immersive programs where they would use Disney to teach the English language. And they were especially big in a lot of Asian countries, in several
Mhm.
Asian countries where um, like kids would go, and I've actually read a book about someone who worked at one of these language immersion centers. And so yeah, that's a very, very good point. It'll be interesting to see like where they go from the future, and then ultimately like obviously where everybody else goes because we are the consumers of that. So with the last few minutes, we have a few rapid questions.
Okay.
Um, and these questions I ask, you can explain if you want. You don't have to explain at all if you want.
Okay.
Some of them deal with the parks, and some of them deal with kind of your background. So first, um, do you have, and I'm going to say, do you have a favorite park? And by that, I mean a different gate, like Hollywood Studios, Epcot, Disneyland, Magic Kingdom.
So when I was a kid, it was Magic Kingdom. And then I grew up a bit and I was like, I'm too cool for Magic Kingdom. It's Epcot. And now as an adult, it's Magic Kingdom.
Okay.
I love Magic Kingdom. I love the like my all of my favorite rides are there. Pirates of the Caribbean, Haunted Mansion are my two favorites. Um, and have been for a really long time. But also there's just like the fireworks show at Magic Kingdom and just everything about it. It's just it's so magical and I love that magic. That's what I want to go to Disney World for. So
Yeah.
that has been my favorite.
Well, you knocked out three questions in that one answer. So good job. Park, ride, and show. Uh,
Oh no, my
favorite.
favorite show is Fantasmic at
Okay.
Hollywood.
You know what? I actually have never seen Phantasmic.
It's
We're
so
usually I at that point, like it's usually kind of trying to make your way around to get the last
mm,
rides in. I'm still in that stage where with, especially when I take my kids, like the idea of a great Disney vacation is being able to ride as much.
right.
One day we went into the parks, into Magic Kingdom. That's my favorite park, and I intentionally took it slow and tried to like just we went in the old Christmas shop
Mm,
and we walked around. I got to tell my, favorite story about, why is the concrete different and Liberty and Liberty Square. But then all of a sudden we saw there was a fast pass, or no, we had a fast pass for Haunted Mansion in like an
mm,
hour, so we were able to take our time. But then we saw there was like a 10-minute wait for Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. So me and my two sons like sprinted over there. So like, we tried to take it slow and then it ends like that. Um, do you have a favorite hotel, a favorite Disney hotel?
mm. Honestly, I do not. The one I want to stay in the most is the one that's like right over by Animal Kingdom and you can look out and you have like
Yeah.
animals. The one I want to stay at most, but I don't have one that I've like liked most staying at.
Okay. Um, a favorite restaurant anywhere on property that could be in any of the parks, Disney Springs, anything.
I know what it is. I just don't know what it's called. It's at Hollywood Studios, and you go in, and it looks like you're at a drive-in theater, and you
Oh,
like, you,
Sci-Fi Drive-In is I think.
yeah, sci-fi drive-in.
Yeah.
And it looks like you're sitting in these like 1950s convertibles. I was obsessed with the 50s as a kid, and that was always my favorite to go and do that. And it's either that or the restaurant in the castle, which I also deeply enjoy.
Okay. A favorite snack when you go to Walt Disney World.
Ooh. I guess it would be the Dole Whips
Okay.
because summer in summer is brutal. Need something to cool down with.
I um I discovered the Dole Whips probably 5 years ago. And
Mhm.
now every time I go, I make up for the fact that for the first 35-ish years that I went to Disney, I didn't have Dole Whips. So now I'm going to ask kind of more on your background for the last few. What is your favorite? And that could be your favorite or the one you think is the best. Your favorite Disney movie that has been adapted from a fairy tale
I'm a fairy tale.
or just a book. Any like doesn't
Yeah.
have to be one of the classic fairy tales.
That is such a big question for me. Oh my gosh, hold on. I'm trying to think. My brain just won't go fast enough for this. Um, I mean, you mentioned Percy Jackson earlier, but I really do think that's good, but that's a streaming show. Um,
Well, I mean that counts though too. Like
I think
it's very close to the book.
I really like Princess and the Frog. Um, and I like it because of the music. Love the music. But also as many problems as that movie has with race, and there are many. It was Disney's real first time doing race bending, and that I think is a very exciting thing to do with adaptation. So I love that adaptation choice, even though not all of the creative decisions around race were great.
Okay. Um, what this can be something that's been adapted to Disney. It could be something that Disney has not touched yet. Do you have a favorite fairy tale or a favorite children's literature book?
Okay, so fairy tale would either be Sleeping Beauty or Little Red Riding Hood. I like neither of those stories, but I find them fascinating and I do research on them all of the time. It's one of the few times where I am like obsessed with something I don't enjoy. But I think they're both really interesting, especially Charles Perrault's The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. Weird story. It's fantastic. There's like an ogress mother-in-law, and she tries to eat the princess. It's a whole thing. It's amazing. Um, and then for a kid's book, um, mm, why can I never remember anything that I've ever read? There's a book that came out in 2021 called The Last Quintista.
Okay.
And it is a sci-fi dystopia story with a disabled Latina girl as the protagonist, and it is fantastic.
Okay. And then last one. If you were asked what children's book or young reader book
Mhm.
you could choose to be produced into a Disney movie or some type of adaptation, what would it be?
So this isn't children's, it's young adult, but and they're starting to make it, which I'm very excited about. Tamora Pierce's Tortal World, I guess.
Okay.
She has several series that are all fantastic. My favorite one is her Becca Cooper series. And I've always wanted to see Becca Cooper like as a series. So they've started working on that. I don't think it's Disney. It might be. I don't know. I don't know which studio's doing it. Disney probably owns it by now. But um, yeah, that's just one that I've always wanted to see. It's one of my favorites.
Okay. Have you ever read the the Kingdom Keeper series or any of those
I
books?
love the Kingdom Keeper series. Also, would love to see that one adapted.
So we've been lucky enough to have Ridley Pearson visit twice. And oh my goodness, I would the newest Kingdom Keeper's Inheritance, Villain's Realm, which is the book two of the Inheritance series, actually comes out like in 11 or 12 days or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, I would absolutely love to see that. And I've heard that I've heard at various times there have been rumors and they've tried to get things started, but the use of the fact that there's so much intellectual property in it could,
Mhm.
has some that's been some pretty big hiccups. It's not, and because that would be a series of movies or a Disney Plus series, it would be so much. It's different from, when they got all the intellectual property they needed to make the latest uh Rescue Rangers movie.
Right.
This would be that times probably 100 or so, you know.
Well, and Ridley Pearson has another book series that he's co-author on, Peter and the
Hmm.
Starcatchers, which is how I got introduced to Ridley Pearson. And I loved Peter and the Starcatchers as a kid. And that's another one that I think would be really fun.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. They so thank you for doing this. For anyone who wants to further like reach out, engage with you, how can they do that in whatever way?
Yeah, so I have a website, Rebecca L. Rowe, that's ROWE, .com, pretty easy to find. And then my email address is rebecca.rowe@tamuc.edu. So you can always just shoot me an email and I'm happy to answer questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And this was really, really fun. Thanks for joining us and walking us through all of this. We'll have to talk about more things. So thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Thanks.